often the most important part of the story is the hook. And then beyond that, you've got the problem. That's, I would suggest, the second most important. The solution need only be fairly brief. That isn't nearly as important as people think, because the objective of this story is just to engage them and get them asking, tell me more about that.
So welcome to the Business Behind Your Business podcast, where we have the conversations to help your business grow and thrive. And look, it's an interesting time of business life at the moment, where we're looking at this situation where a lot of businesses are saying it is very hard to make a sale. It's very hard to get customers to, hand over their cash and buy product or services from them. And why is that so? There are many reasons. Like, a lot of people will say that it's the economy to blame, the economy or the COVID conditions. But you know what? Other people are making sales in those conditions. So, okay, that might be a slowdown, but it's not the main reason people aren't buying. Others would say that you're not actually working hard enough. And look, I know a lot of hardworking people who are struggling with getting sales conversions at the moment. So maybe that's not the answer either. Or it could simply be that your customers or the people that refer work to you don't actually understand what you do and how you can help them and why they need to purchase from you. And look, I'm thinking back to a situation I had many years ago. So just as a reminder, I'm an accountant. I run an accounting and business advice business with small and medium business owners. And I was reviewing the work, the end of year accounts for one of our clients, one of our larger clients as well. And I noticed this really large figure in their expenses. I think it was about $15,000 or $18,000. And I queried them, what did they spend this $15,000 on, and what was the outcome they got? And they were delighted to tell me that was what they paid a consultant to do their business plan and business strategy. Now, I was a bit taken aback because one of our biggest clients has paid somebody else to do work that we could have done because we had a really good knowledge and understanding of their business. So why did they go and pay somebody else when we were the best person to actually deliver that result, that outcome for them with an intimate knowledge of their business? And it made me think that they did not actually know what we did, because their response to me was, when I asked them, why didn't you approach us? They said, well, we thought you only did tax. It made me think that maybe people don't actually understand what I do or what services I do or how I can help them. And that's been bugging me for many, many years, and it still bugs me today, particularly when I'm having conversations with people and they just don't understand that we are more than just doing accounting. So I've talked to a number of business owners, and they've got similar problems, similar issues with getting customers across the door, across the line, and making that sale. So I've turned to the person that I know who's going to answer this question for me and tell me what I'm doing wrong, because I'm not a sales expert and I'm not really sure that I'm doing this right. So I've enlisted the help of Nathan Williams, who we've had on the podcast before, talking about sales. And I've asked Nathan this question: is how do we actually let people know what we do so that they actually have an understanding of how we can help them and why they should buy from us? So Nathan Williams from Customer Return, welcome back to the microphone.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good to have you back. And look, I just want to remind people, your experience. So I'm looking at some of the companies you've worked with in terms of their sales process. And part of the reason I want to say this is because we have many people actually out there that are experts in their business, but you've actually worked with some pretty well-known companies here. I think you've worked with Westpac and NAB and
American Express, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm thinking, from having conversations with you as well offline, that a lot of the process and the methodology that you're teaching to these larger companies are very relevant to small, medium business owners.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And just to go back to your point at the start there, I don't necessarily believe it's the economy that's preventing sales. I mean, that's a wicked, the old saying, it's very easy to talk yourself into a recession. So I don't buy the line that it's the economy. I think there's always opportunities both in an up and a down market. I think when things are static and grinding sideways all the time, That can sometimes be the biggest risk. So I don't think it's the economy. I agree with you. I know a lot of hardworking people that maybe aren't quite making the level of sales that ideally like. To your story, and thank you for sharing that, it's not an uncommon one in that, often when we have multiple service offerings, and I know in your defence, if you will, or by way of context, if that's the terminology, obviously Premium Solutions has a range of offerings. So it's not like you're just selling one thing and that client forgot about the one thing. So that can be challenging for both prospective and existing clients, even if they're long-standing ones, when we've got multiple things to sell. And look, I think what I'd say off the top is last time we spoke about the benefit of pitching, and in addition to that, a little bit about the value of asking the right sales questions and helping generate some repeat business. But certainly one element I'd like to talk today about, Paul, is the benefit of storytelling. And you can think of that either as a subsection of pitching or selling, if you will, or even as it become more popular in the last number of years as a standalone area of sales that should be taken, really seriously. And so, I'd love to talk a bit about that today. And the reason I think it's important is that as people get ever more busier and we receive so many messages every day, it's hard to remember everything. And our brains are hardwired. We've evolved to recall stories better than straight facts and straight data. And I think we can tend to undermine that in business. We're used to making the business case in inverted commas and talking to the rational, logical part of the brain, but we don't have a story to back it up. It can be hard for people to recall. And that may have been what happened with your client who didn't recall or remember that part of the service they could have used of yours.
Yeah, no, I think, look, one of the issues we've had is in the past is a lot of what we've done, and look, accountants work in data, so we try to put things in a very factual basis, but we ignore the fact that, as you mentioned, and you've done some work with us for our business, is this whole idea of storytelling and making people understand what the issues are that you're solving and how you're going to do it and what the benefits are. It's certainly changed the way we've approached, and I've noticed certainly an improvement in our sales conversion once we've been changing the way that we actually communicate with people. But maybe if we actually look at this whole idea of storytelling, why is it important in your sales process?
Yeah, certainly. Let's define it first of all, because I think storytelling can be easy to dismiss. We hear the word storytelling, we think, well, hang on a sec, we're all grown up in business these days. We're not a kid wanting a story from our parents, for example, or sharing stories in the school playground. So the word storytelling can be easy to dismiss, but credit where credit's due. A gentleman by the name of Paul Smith, who wrote a book called Sell with a Story, defines storytelling as a universal master tool to connect with and to influence people. And I think that's quite good. It's quite a broad definition, but if we think about that in I'll call it the client engagement or the business development context, it can certainly be used at the start, so before the prospective client becomes a client. So in the introductory phase, to build rapport, for example, to position your service appropriately, and then during the actual sales pitch and sales process, for example, telling a client success story or a story about someone who avoided a problem with your help. And then towards the tail end of that sales process as well, when you may be negotiating price or overcoming objections, and even after the sale as well, Paul, when it comes to after-sales service and speaking about how clients have best utilised your service for maximum benefit. So that's one reason why I think storytelling is important. It is universal. It does have applicability. People remember stories easier than data and facts, and it can be used throughout the whole sales process. And it cuts across, genders, geographies, various demographics. It just works. There's a reason why it's become increasingly popular the last number of years. So that's certainly one reason why storytelling, is ever more important as we get busier.
Mm-hmm. So I think in that there are three main reasons that we should engage in storytelling. Do you want to sort of just explain a bit more about what those are?
Yeah, certainly. So one of them is certainly building relationships. When we engage in stories or when we tell stories, it does humanise us. It does communicate what we value as people and as business owners. So that strengthens the relationship. So that's certainly useful. Without getting too deep into the neuroscience or the brain science here, there is a a phenomenon, if you will, called neurocoupling, which, to translate that effectively means that when we engage in stories, the listener's brain, more of their brain lights up in response. A chemical called oxytocin is released, which drives empathy and connection with the storyteller, a lot more so than if they're just hearing a bunch of stats. So storytelling does strengthen relationships, and that's, obviously important in the early stages, of the sales process. If you just go straight with data and facts, it can fall a little bit flat. So that's certainly one reason. And we think about us as the recipient of a story. It's not uncommon for us to feel a deeper bond with someone after they've told us a relevant and memorable story. And those two words, relevant and memorable, are important. No point just telling stories that have no relevance. And we can get into that later about what stories to tell and how to do that. So that's certainly one reason, driving the relationship.
Yeah. Okay. So driving that relationship, and I think we talked about that whole idea of referral or referring. How does that tie into storytelling?
Yeah, great. Yeah, great question. So it certainly helps with recall as well. So, there's various studies around this to show that if we're just talking about the short-term memory's ability to retain data and logic, if you will, we can normally retain up to about 7 things, give or take a few either side of that. It's the old saying, you can remember 7 things plus or minus 2. So, that's normally the rule of thumb. But if you wrap that in a story, it is a lot more memorable. And because the recall is enhanced, it can then help drive referral. I'm sure you and I can relate, having been in business for a little while, where you might have met someone, let's call it 1 week, 1 month, or 1 quarter ago, 3 months ago, and you can sort of vaguely recall the outlines of what they told you, but you're trying to grapple with, would they be a good person to refer? So we don't have a story to wrap around it. It can be hard to recall. So certainly the storytelling that succinctly outlines, for example, the problem you solve, the solution you provide, and the outcome you deliver, that is more memorable than a bunch of stats. So it's certainly very, very useful to have a good story to highlight problem, solution, outcome to drive referrals.
Yeah, look, I think thinking back on engagement with other people, and look, you and I are both in the local business chamber. So when people have asked me who can help me with a certain problem, I'm more likely to remember the person I have spoken to that's actually told me about how they've helped somebody, and not just what the services they do, but how they had this issue for a client, what they did to what was the outcome, or what was the impact of that issue, how they went about helping them, and then what was the service, and then what was the outcome to that for that client, and why that was successful. So I'm more likely to remember that kind of engagement with somebody than the one that says, "Hi, I'm Joe. I do websites. We do this much, and it'll cost you this much."
Yeah, it's pretty vanilla. It's easily forgotten, that stuff. And I think it's important, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Paul, because, that's a highly relatable example, trying to remember people that we might have met at an event. But I think it's important here to narrow in on why stories can be more memorable specifically. And I want to make the point that we do find it easier to process and recall stories. So if you want to put it another way, our brains are better story processors than logic processors. We just tend to retain the information better. But specifically for a story to have maximum recall, I'll use the analogy of stories being, a good story at least, being like a roller coaster. And as I mentioned this, think about any good movie you've seen or book you've read. It is like a roller coaster. A good story never just flatlines and stays at a similar level of emotion all the way through. I mean, if you think about a movie, at the start, we're getting connected with the main character and their situation or their dilemma. Normally for about the first, let's call it 12 to 18 minutes, somewhere in there. That's kind of the hook, if you will, if you think about it from a picture or storytelling perspective. Then after that, once we're connected with them, there's normally a problem that they run into. Life's pretty good at the start, but then there's a problem. And then they've got to battle through this problem and try to find a solution to that problem. And sometimes in movies, at least, you might have someone show up to help guide them through that process. And then at the end, if we're talking at least about Hollywood blockbusters, it's normally a happy ever after, or that's the outcome part of the story. So now you might hear that and go, well, how is that relevant to being in business? How it's relevant is when we tell a story in the business context, Think of the roller coaster and the problem, the solution, the outcome. And the key point here I want to emphasize is most people, when they tell stories, just talk about solution and outcome. And it's too much of a flatline story. If we don't start with the problem and before that even, what their client wanted, there's not enough up and down in the story. And when we do have an up and down in the story and go through that story arc, I'll call it, or that narrative, there is a chemical connection where there are endorphins and also cortisol released during that process, which, again, without getting too much into the science of it, if you will, it does bond the listener more to that story because we took them on a journey, as they say. It wasn't just a flatline story.
Absolutely. And I think the journey is part of that whole experience. There's a lot more engagement and building that connection with that prospect or that customer. It seems to be a more of a stronger connection after that they've engaged in that storytelling process.
Well, absolutely. And just to be super clear here, I'm not saying that all logic and rationale is bad. We should never use it. It should be about storytelling, not at all. So it's not an either or scenario. It's not an optional thing. It's a sequential thing. And so, if we think about a fairly typical sales process, there certainly needs to be an element of logic and rationale in the process. But I would be more inclined to start with some emotional aspects of the service you deliver and a good story up front to connect, draw the person in, and then you can back that up with rationale, logic, deliverables, timeframes, all the usual things. So it's not optional, it's just sequential. And so just getting the order right. And that does, as you say, bond the listener more to us and make everything more memorable.
So there's a structure to what you've suggested here in how we go about our storytelling, but would you use that same structure in all types of sales situations? Like I'm thinking these days we've got so many different avenues. We've got our marketing on our website or our brochures or our face-to-face or even just that initial contact. Is the methodology adjusted for the different formats?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll answer that in a moment. I'll just quickly just wrap up the third point of a third reason why storytelling is so important. So beyond the strengthening of the relationship with the listener or the prospect, and then enhancing the recall that can help drive referrals from that listener, the third one is obviously revenue. And I'll mention a really quick story that sort of that makes that point. So a well-known entrepreneur in the States, a guy called Mark Cuban, who bought the worst performing US sports franchise of the 1990s. This team was voted not the kind of award you want to win, the worst sports franchise of a whole decade. But he bought an NBA, a basketball team in the States called the Dallas Mavericks. And he's just bought this business. So he didn't have to do what he did, which is get a desk and put it in the middle of the sales floor of the organisation and start making cold calls to season ticket holders who, as you can imagine, given they were the worst performing US sports franchise of the 1990s, they didn't have a good winning record. And, the strong reaction when he was making these phone calls was, you guys are terrible. I'm not going to come and see you guys. But what he was very clever at doing was understanding what the objections would be, which would be that because they were poorly performed, they were unlikely to spend any money to see the team. And so what he did very cleverly, and this does relate to the question you just asked me before, or an element of it at least, is that he started with, do you know that going to a Mavs game, that's short for Dallas Mavericks, do you know that going to a Mavs game is now cheaper than going to McDonald's for a meal with your family? And so he partially overcame that you guys are terrible objection by saying, hey, going to a basketball game is actually cheaper than going to McDonald's, which is very smart positioning because when you and I think about McDonald's, one thing that we think of is cheap. They own that space in terms of food. So that was really good positioning in terms of that first objection. The second one about you guys are terrible, I think you're going to lose. Why I put myself through that was he actually said to the season ticket holders, can you remember the first time you went to see a professional sports team play with your parents? And he would just let that question hang and the listener would go, yep. And it was a very clever question because the season ticket holders he were calling normally had kids. Or certainly the ones he asked this question of, they all had kids. And so what it did was it overcame that fear of, I'm going to see you guys lose. I don't want to put myself through that, by talking about what was more important to them, because it bonded them with their kids. So it wasn't about, was the team going to win or lose? It was, was it a great experience to help bond them with their kids? And, you and I both got kids, as you know. That cuts through a lot of objections. If you think, I'm going to go to a place that's cheaper than Macca's and it's going to bond me closer with my child. Well, that's a great pitch. And so I know that was slightly long, but the reason we mentioned that story, Paul, is that while there's a 5-point story structure that I'll mention later, and I've already alluded to it in terms of parts of it with the problem, the solution, the outcome, he had a very effective story just by having 2 questions which hooked the prospect, which was simply, did you know Game or Mavs game is cheaper than Macca's? And do you remember the first time you went to a professional sports game with your parents? So all he did was have a really good hook. And as a result of that, sales went up, they managed to acquire better players, and the team had a lot of success.
So you're talking about the hook there, and I'm guessing that without that hook, you really wouldn't get through the rest of your sales process. If you couldn't get somebody at the hook, it wouldn't matter how good the rest of your process is. It's all to no avail.
Well, yeah, look, 2 things there. It depends on how short on time and energy and attention the listener is, but certainly, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Paul, often the most important part of the story is the hook. And then beyond that, you've got the problem. That's, I would suggest, the second most important. The solution need only be fairly brief. That isn't nearly as important as people think, because the objective of this story is just to engage them and get them asking, tell me more about that. How do I do that? So the solution isn't super important. The outcome is important, but not even as important as the problem. And then the 5th and final component is the call to action is really important. A lot of people, even when they tell a good story, can forget about, suggesting the next step or recommending the next step. Because in business, we don't want to feel like we're imposing on people, but there is a way to, make a recommendation, as an expert. So they're the 5 parts of the storytelling structure. Number 1, the hook. Number 2, the problem. Number 3, the solution. Number 4, the outcome. And then number 5, the call to action or the recommendation. But you make a great point or ask a great question. The call to action is super important. And just on that, if I may, very quickly, Steve Jobs, when he launched the iPod, he had a great hook, because he knew that Walkmans and other music alternatives at that time generally only stored about 10 to 20 songs and were quite expensive. And I can see you nodding your head, which tells me you might know the hook. But the hook was, iPod, 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Yep.
Now, that's a great hook, because it's such a big difference, such a big advantage over the competitors at that time. So having a hook that disrupts the listener, that shows a big point of difference, a big competitive advantage, is absolutely key. So in business, I think we need to think about ourselves almost as journalists writing a really good header, in the newspaper. What's going to grab the attention of the listener, rather than getting mired in the details too much.
So I'm just thinking, okay, so we're doing a podcast. So it's a very audio based here, but I'm thinking, one really good example of this structure and how it's set out. If we actually went to your website at the moment, so the customer return website, very easy to see those steps laid out before us.
Yeah, thank you. And I didn't quite answer that part of your question before, but to answer it now, the short version is, when you pitch verbally versus in writing, for example, whether it's a sales brochure or website, the formats are slightly different, because the way people hear and retain words is different to how they read and absorb. So we've just spoken about the storytelling structure, but when it comes to a website, if you think about your homepage from top to bottom, really good to have, I'll put it in these terms, either the hook or the outcome you deliver, or the promise, if you will, at the top of the site. So on our side on the homepage, it says clarify your sales message and win more clients. So that's the hook or the promise, if you will. And then beyond that, without giving a lot more examples, people can go to the website, check it out if you'd like, and we'll give details of that later. But beyond that, you've then got to talk about, as we alluded to earlier, when we've already laid out what the reader in this instance wants, we've then got to talk about the problem. So what's the problem we're solving? And then beyond the problem we're solving, then talk a little bit about the solution, how we do that, and give some structure. So it's engage with emotion up top by talking about the promise or the outcome or the hook, if you will. Engage further with emotion by talking about the problems they're probably facing. And that's really important, Paul, because they've got to relate to those problems that we're solving for them, because if they don't, they won't buy. So that relatability is so key. And then once we've done that, we can engage with a bit more logic by talking about the solution, what are the deliverables, then having some social proof with testimonials or case studies, if you will. And so, people can go to our website and check it out. More than happy for people to get ideas from that. But the format of a web page is different to how you tell a story verbally. And then the format of a brochure is a little bit different again.
As I see on the website, you've got your social proof. I think about step 5 or 6 in that process. Whereas I think when you're actually talking to somebody face to face, you're probably introducing that case study or that story example earlier in the conversation.
You certainly can. You certainly can. The commonality there is, on the website up the top there, we've got the hook, and you do that with storytelling as well. You certainly can, and that's a fairly natural thing to do, verbally when you're face to face with someone or over the phone, to give examples of who you work with, because it does establish credibility early on. But the web content, as I said earlier, the structure of the information is a little bit different in terms of the order and the structure of it.
Yeah. So I think you need to look at the format of your delivery, but also who your audience is in delivering your story, your sales story.
And also in terms of the audience, I'd say try to get a sense of, by asking them questions first, ideally, if you can, are they the sort of person that wants to have a longer conversation and a bigger narrative, or do they just want the short version? And so, for example, I don't know if you had this situation before, but if we're in a meeting and the other person has taken up a bunch of the airtime, and we're getting towards, let's say 3/4 of the way through a 1 hour meeting, and we're thinking, oh God, there's so much stuff I've got to mention. Like, how am I going to cram this in? My quick point would be don't try to cram it in. Maybe just go straight to a story. So stories can be a great get out of jail card, I'll call them, if we're short on airtime in a meeting. And so that's important to remember, because it's certainly useful. So it does depend on who you're speaking with and their natural sort of style, if you like, and how much information they'd like.
Okay. So if we're wrapping this up, we came to the conclusion pretty early on that it's not the economy why we're not getting sales, and it's not because we're not working hard. But the fact is that a lot of people just don't understand how we can actually help, or how our product or service will help with that issue that they're facing, that whether it's saving time, saving money, fixing a need, that engagement. So you mentioned the example with the family experience, that experience of going to a game. And I certainly remember the first time I went to some live sport, seeing some of my childhood heroes, and actually recounting those stories of how I first went to an NRL game. And I went and saw, this will show my age, but Parramatta back in the 1980s with Peter Sterling, Mick Cronin, Ray Price, and telling that story to my children, who are following and just watching their engagement as I recounted what it was like to actually go and watch these guys in person. So I certainly understand that process. That gels with me. But I think for a lot of people that story does connect, and we've certainly seen an increase in our sales conversions since we've started using storytelling a lot more in our process. So what would be, in just summarizing, what would be the key things if you're only going to do a couple of things in improving your sales process? What would be the key things here from what we've talked about today?
Yeah, so in terms of sales process and how it relates to storytelling, what I would do, and I alluded to this earlier in broad terms, was think about the parts of your sales process where stories can best serve you. And I mentioned before that You can use them in the introductory part of the sales process to build rapport. You can use them as you're doing the sales pitch, and you can give, for example, a story that talks about a problem you solved, number one, an outcome you delivered. Just that alone could be a second story within the main sales pitch, or a third story could be an example of a client that went down road A versus road B, i.e. they took your advice, bought the service versus a client that didn't. And the reason why that story or that type of story is really good, Paul, is that the brain likes contrast when it's trying to make a decision. So that story is referred to the two roads story, and it's really powerful because it provides contrast. So if you've got a good story about a client that went down, let's call it road A, and took the high road or followed your advice in a certain way or with a certain service versus one that didn't, and you can show that gap, I think that is a really good story. So I'd certainly encourage people to have what I call a two-road story to show the contrast. And to make it easier for the listener, you ideally want to make the two stories about businesses that are very similar in terms of industry, size, problem that you are looking to solve. I think that is a really good story to tell. So, that's examples of stories in the introductory phase, in the main sales pitch phase. As I said earlier, like towards the end of the sales process, you can use stories to negotiate price, overcome objections. And just quickly with overcoming objections, I think using stories proactively to overcome unspoken objections are really important. So you might have a story about a prospect that initially thought the price was too high, but then after the value that you delivered, it really set their mind at ease and they thought it was a great investment. So I think that is really useful. Having stories like that ready to go. So during the whole sales process there, some of the ways I'd use stories, and specifically within a meeting, I think it's also important to mention that think about stories as being useful for up to 10% of the content in a meeting. So if you've got a 60-minute meeting, have roughly 3 2-minute stories or thereabouts ready to go that might overcome some common objections. So that's how I think about it in a meeting within the broader sales process as well.
Great. And look, we've mentioned the website, customerreturn.com.au. There are some actual, diagnostics or available? Yeah,
thank you. So, people can go to customerreturn.com.au and what you'll see there is there's our 3 programs are the Perfect Pitch program, and we do storytelling as part of that, our strategic selling program and our Referral Plus program. And each of those 3 programs have a diagnostic attached to it, which is simply 7 questions where people can rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 3, 1 being, we don't do this well, 3 being we do it really well, and 2 being obviously in the middle. And off the back of those 7 questions, people get a score out of 21 and some initial advice about the impact and the meaning of their score, and then what they can do as a next step off the back of that. So that's certainly a good place to start.
Great. Then we'll put links to the website and those diagnostics in the show notes for you to follow. And and look, if you do want to improve your sales process, if you're like me, you're an expert in your own business, but you're not an expert in every part of your business. And sales is one area which is crucial. We're all talking about how we can get more sales in the door, because sales leads to profit and cash flow. So encourage you to reach out to Nathan and find out. You've heard the story today of how he can sell and how he can help you sell more. So reach out to Nathan and get started to more sales and more success.
And in fact, Paul, if I may, more than happy to receive emails at nathan@customerreturn.com.au. And for anyone that emails me at that address, I'll reply with an example story, which brings to life a bit more of the structure we were talking about today. And it's a story that we use with one of our clients, which they're happy for me to share with other people. So if anyone would like an example of a story that we use in our business about a buyer's agent actually who increased their conversion rate by 85%, not by doing anything better in terms of his expertise, but just by getting better at the sales process of pitching and telling his own story, more than happy to reply to any emails with that story.
Great. That's a great offer, and encourage you to take that up. And Yeah, certainly looking at ways that we can help you grow your business, run a better business, and keep listening to the Business Behind Your Business podcast. And if you know another business owner that would benefit from content like what we had today, then please share that with them. And don't forget to check out the website, www.thebusinessbehindyourbusiness.com, for additional resources and tools and links to the show notes where you can find out more about customer return and how Nathan can help you sell more in your business and convert more sales. So again, thank you for listening. I encourage you to keep listening, and looking forward to you joining us next time.
Great. Thanks, Paul.